And this time we're going to move to the book of Zechariah to find out some interactions of Malach Yahweh with Zechariah. We'll need a couple of sessions to get through Zechariah. He has several interactions with Malach Yahweh, and some of the interactions are pretty significant, so we'll take a peek at that. Well, we're going to look at least two of them anyhow. Zechariah, along with Haggai, was a prophet to Israel during the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding that followed the 70-year captivity in Babylon. It's a time when Ezra led some people back to Jerusalem and to Judea. Later on, Nehemiah was involved in some of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, but Haggai and Zechariah were those who prompted the people to get off their backsides and to get on with the rebuilding of the temple, bringing them God's message. Said, hey, you guys have your houses all fixed up, fine, but where's mine? On one particular night, this is the central focus of the book of Zechariah. On one night, Zechariah had count them, 8 separate visions. They were directly from God, and they were each dealing with Israel's future. Zechariah is considered by many to be the most complete book of prophecy in the Old Testament. So we're going to look at the first of those 8 visions today, and we'll look at the 4th vision in our next session. These are the 2 visions where Malach Yahweh predominates in some respect. By the way, again, most scholars seem to claim that Zechariah is the most complete prophecy, end times prophecy at least, found in the Old Testament. But before we begin, I'd like to discuss a bit about the ways God speaks to his people. Most is from John MacArthur's commentary on Zechariah, about a 400-page commentary, as I remember, for a minor prophet. Zechariah, however, is not shorter than some. He's, 14, 15 chapters. I want to start in Hebrews 1:1. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers through their prophets in many portions and in many ways. So God spoke to the prophets in many ways. We'll mention some of those in a bit. And then there's an angry God speaking to the error of Aaron, the first high priest, and Miriam, his sister, by pointing out some of the ways that God spoke through the prophets. I'm looking at Numbers 12, beginning in verse 6. I'll read 6, 7, and part of 8. This is Yahweh. He said, this is Yahweh again speaking, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth. We'd say face to face, but the Hebrew says mouth to mouth, even openly and not in dark sayings. So here we have God saying, I speak to my prophets in visions, in dreams, and face to face. At least where Moses was concerned. Now, what's the difference between a vision and a dream? Dreams occur while one is asleep. Visions occur while one is awake. Both are pictured in some sense, pictures or events that you see in your mind's eye. Uh, so there's a difference between them. Now, Zachariah's were at night, but they were visions. They were not dreams. As a matter of fact, Zachariah even gets involved in one of them. It was so real to him that he jumps up and responds to something. We'll see that next time. Yahweh spoke of communications by way, again, of visions, dreams, and direct verbal conversations. Remember, that's one of the attributes of our God. He is a verbal God. He will speak and we will understand. He is verbal. MacArthur goes on to say, and I'm going to quote a section here from John. To Moses, God spoke directly and clearly, but to many of the prophets, he spoke in visions and dreams, which required careful interpretation. As the Lord declared in Psalm 78, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will pour forth dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers recounted to us. Dark sayings includes enigmatic visions, which, unlike dreams, were revelatory scenes given to the prophet while he was awake. Even so, they were not tangible, they were not physical realities, but realities that were spiritually perceived and discerned. Paul's testimony to the character of a vision in 2 Corinthians 12:1 to 12:1 through 12:4 shows that sometimes even the recipient was not certain of the nature of a vision. So they appear to be real to the individual, although they are not real. They are spiritually understood and perceived. In the visions of Zechariah, there's an angel. It's not Malach Yahweh. It's not the angel of Jehovah, but it's another angel who interacts with Zechariah so that Zechariah might understand each of the 8 visions completely. The vision was a form of God's revelation, and it was given graciously through the provision of interpretation. As I said, this is not unusual to have an angel interpreting. Think of Revelation even. John was accompanied by some angel who would continually talk to him about what John was seeing. So, in chapter 1, we're going to see the first vision, and it's going to present Malach Yahweh appearing as a man astride a red horse. Now, so here again is Malach Yahweh appearing as a man. Zechariah 1, I'm going to begin in verse 7, and we'll read through verse 13. On the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month Shebat, in the second year of Darius, or Darius, however you pronounce it, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah the prophet, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, as follows. And here is the beginning of Zechariah's description of that vision, beginning in verse 8. And I think we'll stop here and not read all the way through to verse 13. We'll get to those in a minute. Here's verse 8. I saw at night, and behold, a man was riding on a red horse. Now that's Malach Yahweh. We'll see in a minute. And he was standing among the myrtle trees. So he was riding and then he was standing, which were in the ravine. So we've got myrtle trees, which incidentally were essentially shrubs. Myrtle trees did not become much in the way of a tree as we think of it. And they were in a ravine. And a ravine, of course, is a hole in the ground, so to speak, with red, sorrel, and white horses behind him. So here is someone that we will see as Malach Yahweh has been riding this horse, a red horse, and behind him there are red, sorrel, and white horses. And who are on those horses? We'll see later that they are probably angels. Let me go on to verse 9 here. Then I, Zechariah, said, and he's now talking to his angel, who's his translator, if you please, my Lord, what are these? And the angel who was speaking with me said to me, I will show you what these are. So there are several points I'd like to make here. Again, the man will soon be seen to be supernatural, not an ordinary human being. Myrtle trees, again, are a type of bush that were prevalent in Israel of that day. I imagine they probably still are, although in the cities you might not see bushes, but at least myrtle bushes, I'm not sure. The ravine may be symbolic of the hole Israel had dug for itself in spiritually and in bondage. So it's maybe a spiritual and a bondage hole that Israel dug for itself. Why or how? Well, we'll see later on. It was by the corruption and sin of the nation. The red horse now is different. It's symbolic of a warrior who rides in victory over every opponent and every threat. And this man rode in on a red horse into the ravine. Now he's standing in the ravine beside his horse and in front of other horses. Even the timing given in verse 7 is loaded with helpful information for understanding the book and the visions. The timing has to do with Darius, who, remember, led the Medes and Persians to conquer Babylon, and then was used by God to bring a number of Jews, a fairly decent number of Jews, back to Jerusalem and Judah from the captivity. So Darius defeated Babylon, defeated, who was it, Nebuchadnezzar's son or grandson, forget precisely, and then took over and told many of the Jews, look, you can go back and build your temple. God said that he was doing that under God's own direction. So he was being God's agent in restoring Israel to nationhood. Verses 8 and 9 gave Zechariah and the people some information that was needed because people at that time evidently thought God wasn't really doing much of anything. It's interesting. That was Habakkuk's problem. He said, hey, Lord, look at all this evil going on in Judah, and you're not doing anything that I can see. And I can't reconcile your inactivity with the existence of evil. God later told him, don't sweat it, Habakkuk. A lot of stuff is going on. I'm busy as usual. You're just looking in the wrong places. So in verse 8 and 9, what do we have? A statement that implies that God was actively involved in their world at that time, even though they were not aware of it, as Habakkuk wasn't. God was actually moving his plan along. And that plan, you're going to see eventually, leads to Israel's complete restoration, which still hasn't happened, by the way. That complete restoration will happen at Christ's return, and we'll talk about that a bit more. Did you notice that the man introduced as riding on the red horse was then said to be standing? And that to us doesn't have any significance. But apparently he rode into the scene, dismounted, and in standing around as he waited for a report that was shortly to come his way. Now that's an implication that there is a report, a scouting report, you would assume, if this is a military type of situation. Evidently, there was a squad sent out in reconnaissance to find out what's going on around the world, what's the enemy doing, and so forth. So this guy riding a red horse is symbolic of military victory, but apparently the fight hasn't taken place yet. So, because he's standing there waiting for his report. Just read now verses 10 through 13. And the man, remember this is Malach Yahweh, who was standing among the myrtle trees, answered and said. Now notice, this is answering the statement that the angel who was interpreting for Zechariah, the angel said, I'm going to tell you what this means. Well, he doesn't. Malach Yahweh steps in and describes what's going on. So again, starting in verse 10, and the man, Malach Yahweh, who was standing among the myrtle trees by the red horse, answered and said, these are those, talking, I'm assuming, about those who had ridden the other horses into the ravine. These are those whom the Lord, Yahweh, has sent to patrol the earth. Like I said, this was evidently a scouting patrol. So, verse 11, so they, that's those on the other horses, answered the angel of the Lord. There we go. Now it says in verse 11 that this is Malach Yahweh. So those who were on the other horses answered the angel of the Lord, answered Malach Yahweh, who was standing among the myrtle trees. And it figures that this is who that man's been all along. And they said, we have patrolled the earth, and behold, all the earth is peaceful and quiet. And there's some significance to that in a minute. Verse 12, then the angel of the Lord answered and said, O Lord of hosts. Now, what do we have? We have Malach Yahweh speaking to Yahweh. So we'd have Malach Yahweh evidently speaking to God the Father. O Yahweh of hosts, how long wilt thou have no compassion for Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, with which thou hast been indignant these 70 years? So he's speaking about Israel and the last 70 years of captivity. Verse 13, and the Lord answered the angel, that this angel would be Malach Yahweh again, I believe. No, he said, let me read all of verse 13. And the Lord answered the angel who was speaking with me with gracious words, comforting words. Uh, Again, I think I mentioned this was Habakkuk's problem. He said, Lord, I don't see you doing anything in the midst of evil. And this time, Malak Yahweh says, Lord, why have you not shown compassion on Israel for 70 years? It's kind of an interesting thought itself. We're told that these other riders have been put out on some kind of a scouting mission, reconnaissance, if you're into the military term. The report, going to put an F in there instead of a V. The report in verses 10 and 11 told Zechariah that God was alert, in the know, and he was active because it was Yahweh who sent these guys out. But these guys came back. They didn't report to God the Father. They reported to Malak Yahweh. And of course, by now you know whom I'm thinking this is. The world in general wrongly, and this is what the report really tells them. The world in general wrongly thought everything was okay. And so it was at rest and peace. So the world thinks, easy time. Things are perfect. On top of it. We're okay, you're okay, all that stuff. Another curious point. It was Malak Yahweh, not the attending angel, who responded with the interpretation for Zechariah. Just something I mentioned a bit earlier. The fact that Malak Yahweh was standing waiting for a report again indicates that the war he was prepared to wage was yet future. How about end times future? He did not appear to be riding back from victory. He rode into the ravine, and instead of taking bows and so forth, he simply got off and waited for the report that he wanted. In verse 12, Malak Yahweh interceded with Yahweh on behalf of a beleaguered Judah. Remember, he said, you've been 70 years without compassion. When will you show compassion? And his petition was directed at another person. He didn't talk to himself. There was another person called Yahweh, and Yahweh answered him. So again, when we're talking about Yahweh on one hand and Malak Yahweh on the other, we're talking about two personalities interacting. This is one of several references that we've already seen where we have two people, both of whom are actually called Yahweh. And we'll speak about that a bit later. Again, not next time, but the time after that, as we wrap all of this study up. God's compassion was yet to come. It was future. It had not been displayed in its fullness during 70 years of captivity. So what does it mean that God was indignant? We think he didn't like it much. Well, it's a lot stronger than that. The Hebrew word is a very strong word indicating wrath that precedes judgment. So he's more than just ticked. He's ready to display his wrath. And that wrath had already been poured out on Babylon. She had been defeated. But the final pouring out of wrath and the final judgment still await even to this day. 2 Peter 3:9 says, the Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. And by the way, if you look up the context, that's for all to come to repentance doesn't look like it means everyone who ever existed. It means everyone who is among the elect. People will argue over that rather clearly. Okay, but notice Malak Yahweh didn't accuse God of being slow. He just said, when will you? So he's asking the question, and God responded in a way. In fact, look again at verse 13. It may actually be using Yahweh as a reference to Malak Yahweh. What am I saying? I'm saying that verse 13 likely claims Malak Yahweh is Yahweh, making two personalities, both called Yahweh. Two personalities, one title. So what do we have? Well, first thing, God has a plan. The plan is ready. God's actively moving his plan forward. Malak Yahweh appears as a male warrior prepared for a future battle. And we know what that's going to be. But Malak Yahweh takes time to explain God's seeming inaction and to intercede on the behalf of his people. Apparently, Malak Yahweh was deemed to be Yahweh by Zechariah, who is considered to be the author of this material. Well, we're not finished with Zechariah and his interaction with Malak Yahweh. We're going to see it in the fourth vision. This was the first. We're going to see it in the fourth vision, which to me is one of the best passages in the Old Testament. And we'll speak about why I feel that way. But let's move on to another event in chapter 3, but we're not going to move on to it now. We'll move on to it in a bit. Well, in a bit meaning next time. Thank you for being here. We'll see you then if you can continue to